Welcome back. Today we're going to take a little of this, add a little bit of this, even add a couple of these, and turn it into some beautiful fly boxes. Come on, I'll show you how. I'd like each of these boxes to have a unique top with a live edge epoxy river going right through the middle of it. Let's try to figure this out and see how it goes. I'm going to use this piece to start the project with. As you can see, it's got some bark on there, and I'll need to remove that. I get asked all the time, should I remove the bark from an epoxy piece? Because the bark actually looks pretty cool. The answer to that is absolutely. Bark continues to grow even after the tree dies. So if you do not remove this bark, there's a chance that it's going to flake off and your piece will break later on. To start this, I'll just take a chisel and get off all the big chunks that I can. And you can see why you wouldn't want to leave this on your piece. I was able to get the bulk of the bark off with a chisel. Now I'll just take some 60 grit sandpaper and sand off those last little bits that are hard to get to. If I was going to leave this live edge exposed, I'd take different measures to get this cleaned up, but since I'm doing a tinted epoxy pour and you'll never see this, I'm just gonna use sandpaper. All right, I got my pieces here. They're each cut down to 9 inches in length. They are about 7/8 of an inch thick. I don't need my tops to be this thick, but anytime I'm working with epoxy, I like to leave everything a little bit thicker than I need. The next thing we have to do is make some molds. To make the mold, I'm just putting a little bit of caulk on each edge. Make sure I get a nice seal and I don't get any epoxy leaks. Taking my edge piece, and I'm just gonna hold it in place with a couple of nails. This should be plenty to hold this in place for a pour this size. This is not a huge pour. The next thing I'm doing is put a layer of this Tyvek tuck tape on the bottom of my mold. While this will help reduce some of the leaks and make sure the epoxy doesn't run out, that's not its main purpose. That's why we also use some caulking. The real purpose of this is to make sure that our epoxy project doesn't stick to this plywood mold that we made. Another little thing I did on this mold is I left these end tabs a little bit long on each side. My hope is that once everything's cured, I'll be able to whack that with a hammer and make it a little bit easier to get this stuff out. You can see here I'm going to get a really nice fit with this, and I'll be able to put my other box here in the bottom. Now there's a reason I went to this extreme with this small of an epoxy pour, and some of you probably think I'm crazy, but every time I've cut corners on anything, including epoxy, it usually comes back to haunt me. I end up with a leak, or something uneven, or something just doesn't ever turn out right. So my advice is to never cut corners when working with epoxy. I don't really know how this is gonna work, but here we go to the next step. The next thing I'm doing is clamping my pieces of wood into my mold. You'd be surprised how much wood will float in epoxy. I've seen people use bricks and weights and other things like that to hold their epoxy down, but in my experience, you can't beat a clamp. One other pro tip, make sure that you put some of that tuck tape on anything that is going to be inside the mold so that if your piece runs over, the epoxy doesn't stick to your clamp. Epoxy sticks to just about everything except for this tuck tape. The epoxy I'm going to use today is Liquid Glass Deep Pour. The reason I like this epoxy is because it cures extremely slow. What that allows me to do is get all the bubbles out of my project. By taking a couple of days to cure, this allows all that air to come out to the top, leaving me less bubbles to fill in later. I always like to mix this before I add the color. It's kind of hard to see, but you can definitely see the difference between the resin and the hardener in the cup. So I like to make sure that I get everything mixed together nice and well before I add any color. The other thing I like to do is make sure I scrape the sides of my cup really well and try to get the bottom really well as I'm stirring. I'm going to color both of my pours with this black diamond powder pigment. I'm going to choose emerald green for the first pour because that's my brother's favorite color and this first fly box is for him. He's the one that's trying to convince me it's a good idea to spend a lot of money to do fly fishing. And just to jazz it up a little bit, I'm going to add a little pearl white too. And while it's a good idea to scrape the edges of your cup when you're mixing, never scrape the edges of your cup when you're pouring. If you scrape the edges of the cup while you're pouring, you have an opportunity to get some of this resin that maybe didn't mix in all the way into your pour and create soft spots or make it sticky. The second pour is going to be blue because that's my fly guide's favorite color. This one's for you, Alex. And honestly, what fun would epoxy be without a little fire? I'll just take this fire and pop those bubbles in that epoxy. Okay, back to reality. The next few hours are really critical with epoxy. I'll come back every 2 hours or so for the first 4 to 6 hours and double check the progress. I'll make sure that there's not a lot of bubbles, that I'm not getting some flash curing or anything like that. We'll just wait 4 or 5 days for this stuff to cure. There are options out there that'll cure quicker, but again, I like this one because I don't get as many bubbles. All right, these have been drying for over a week. Time to bust them out of the mold. And there we go, got them out of the mold. They look pretty good. The next thing I need to do is get these cleaned up. These are quite a bit thicker than I need as well. I only need them to be maybe 1/4 of an inch thick. One thing I could do is take them and put them on a router sled, which I may end up doing, but first I'm gonna try my planer. I think this will be a little bit quicker and cleaner than a router sled, and maybe I won't have as much cleanup to do in the sanding process. However, if I start noticing a bunch of chip out in my epoxy, I'll stop and then I'll move to a router sled. Since these are so thick, I can test this out to see if it's gonna work without totally ruining my piece. So I'll go really slow through the planer, taking off maybe 1/64 of an inch at a time, and we'll see how it goes. That actually turned out really well. I went really slow on my planer, making sure to flip my board every few passes and take really shallow cuts, only maybe 1/64 of an inch at a time, to make sure that A, I didn't heat up my epoxy or get a bunch of chip out. And that is going to give me something that I can work with very easily. All right, I got a couple of scrap pieces of walnut that are going to be the bottom of my fly boxes. I just went with the size that'll fit for my foam insert for my flies. This thing is what holds the flies. The next thing I need to do is hollow out the bottom of my box to fit this foam piece that'll hold the flies. To do this, I'm going to use my router with a 1/4 inch straight upcut bit and a collar on it that gives me a 1/64 inch reveal. This collar will ride around the inside of my jig. I made this jig using some scrap plywood and some CA glue. I simply made it the shape and size that I needed, and I added some little buffers on the back to hold my piece in place while I router it. So now I can take the bottom of my box, fit it into my jig, and now I can just run the router around the outside and in the middle to hollow out the inside of this box. All right, it didn't turn out perfect, and playing human CNC machine is not the funnest thing in the world, but after 3 or 4 passes, I've got a nice hollowed out box there that I can now sand and finish down. Pretty happy with that for my first try. The next thing I want to do is rough cut my tops to size. I'll use a flush trim router bit to get them perfectly fitted to the bases. To do this, I'm going to take the jig that I used for my router to router out the inside, and I'm just going to use this to kind of determine how I want my top to look. This will kind of let me see what my top will look like when it's complete, because it's about the same size as my base. Then we'll rough cut those down on the table saw and the miter saw. Next, I'm just adding some blue tape to the bottom of my box. I'll add some to my lid. Put a little CA glue, some activator on my top. I'll just glue this down where I want it. Now I can take my flush cut router bit and go all the way around the edge and make sure that this top perfectly matches the bottom. And here you can see how this will work. That ball bearing at the very bottom will ride on the base of my box, and the blade on the top, the red part, is going to cut my top flush with my base. The last thing I want to do is take my small trim router and a 1/8 inch roundover bit and put a nice rounded edge on the top of this. I also took the time to put that same 1/8 inch roundover on the bottom edge and on each corner as well. Don't worry, I'll spare you the part where I spend the rest of my day sanding. To get this epoxy nice and smooth, what I'm going to do is start at 150 and work my way up to 320. One thing you can do to make sure that you're getting perfect swirls every time you sand is to just hold it up to a very bright light and just check your work along the way. Once you have consistent swirling with each grit, then it's okay to move up. If you have any deep lines or anything that you're seeing, it's usually best to go down a grit and start over. For my next trick, I'm going to try to drill a hole in the corner of this box. This will hold what I hope to be a copper rivet that will allow this box to pivot. Well, that'll allow this box to pivot open and slide closed. The problem with this is I didn't leave myself a whole lot of room up here in the corner to drill a hole, and I've got the world's oldest, most rickety drill press. So this could ruin the whole project. Drilled a hole through, now to open it up and see where it went, and it looks like we just made it. I'm happy with that. The next thing I want to do is drill a shallow hole in the bottom part of my box and in the lid. That will hold one of these rare earth magnets. That way when you clip the box closed, it'll stay shut. To figure out where I need to drill on both sides so this lines up perfectly, I went ahead and put one of my copper nails through the hole just to hold everything and line it up in place. Then I'm taking a little bitty nail from my nail gun and I'm putting it in between both boards where I want it lined up, smashing it down. I don't know if you can see it, but it's leaving a little bitty mark on the bottom and the top of my lid, right where I want the center of that hole to go. And I'll just make a little hole about 1/8 of an inch deep that I can put a rare earth magnet in. One in the top, one in the bottom. That should do it. To hold these magnets in place, I'll just use a little CA glue. And these magnets will only stick one way. What a mess. Next, I'm going to give everything a good cleaning with some mineral spirits. I'll be finishing each box with a little bit of my favorite finish, Rubio Monocoat. This is the pure color. I like to use a white buffing pad and just buff it into the wood. You'll see where it soaks in a little bit better in some places. Just keep rubbing it into those spots. All right, after about 5 minutes, you just want to take a clean cloth. I'm just going to use a shop rag in this case and just wipe off all the excess. Just keep buffing it until it's not sticky anymore and your towel just glides smoothly over the surface. You can see that gives it a nice low sheen finish. It's a very thin finish, so you can kind of feel the grain of the wood in there still. It was originally developed for hardwood floors and gives a very good protective finish. What do you guys like to use on your fly boxes? Leave me a comment down below. Okay, we're gonna let those dry for about 2 days and then we'll come and finish them up. What was that, Lucy? Bailey? Lucy, what do you think of the fly boxes? All the pieces have had a chance to dry. Now there's just a couple of more things we need to do to finish them up. First thing I wanna do is add these little foam pads. These foam pads are what will hold the flies in the box. Adding the foam pad is pretty self-explanatory. Each one of these has an adhesive back, so I'll just peel off the protective cover for the adhesive sticker, place my pad in the middle of my fly box, and just use a little bit of pressure, push it in, and make sure it doesn't move. And we have one last thing to do, which I've been dreading this whole time. What I'm going to do is put a hand-driven copper rivet in the corner of each box. The way I do copper rivets is by using a copper nail and a copper washer. I've already drilled the holes. I'll put the nail through the hole. I'll put the copper washer on the nail, and you can see it's just a little bit smaller than the nail. I'll use this scrap piece of wood with a hole in it to drive that copper washer flat with the top surface of my material. Next, I'll take a pair of wire cutters and I'll just cut this copper nail about 1/4 inch above that rivet, and then I'll peen over the top of that with a hammer. I'll show you how. I'm going to take my box and I want this head of the nail to be on the underside of the box. So I'm going to stick this nail through the box like so. Next, I'll take my copper washer, put it on that nail, and using my scrap piece of wood, just going to drive that copper washer down so that it's flush with the top of my box. So there you can see the bottom of the nail and the top of the copper washer. Now I'll just take my wire cutters. I'm going to cut this a little less than 1/4 of an inch, probably 1/8 of an inch closer to the top of the box. Usually like to get it started and then take my pliers and wiggle it back and forth a little bit, like so. I'll take the little round part of my ball peen hammer and I'll peen a rose head on this. And there you can see it peens over into rose heads. And now that I've got my rivet in there, you can see I now have a box that I can slide open. Magnet helps keep it closed. Leave a comment down below what you think I should make next with epoxy. Give me a thumbs up if you learned something new. And if you like epoxy videos, check out this video where I made a walnut and epoxy checkerboard.